I'm Pete Simi, Associate Professor of Sociology at Chapman University and Director of the Earl Babby Research Center. I've been studying white supremacist groups for the past 20 years.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us tonight, Pete. Um, what are some themes that you found with respect to studying extremists, either of a particular ideology or across ideologies? What are some lessons learned that you found from actually interacting with these folks, huh?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time conducting field work where I've actually interviewed folks face to face, sitting down with them, trying to get a sense of their perspective and understand how they came to see the world in the way that they do and how they became involved in these types of groups. I've spent time with them attending rallies, music shows, spending time with them just at home, doing everyday living type things, watching them raise their kids and interact with their family members. And some of them actually allowed me to live with them in their homes in order to really get a sense of kind of their everyday lives and try and understand their kind of culture and understand them in their natural environment. And in doing that over the last 2 decades, I've learned a lot. Obviously, seen a lot. I think one of the more surprising, interesting things has been that folks who get involved in white supremacist groups really come from all walks of life. There's kind of common stereotypes that these folks tend to be, from lower socioeconomic status, backgrounds, maybe less educated, less intelligent. But I've, spent time with folks that were, professionals, well-educated, very intelligent, bright folks, articulate. You really find a wide variety of individuals who are involved in these types of groups. And I think that's very important because what it tells us is that these groups have a much broader recruitment potential and appeal than we often think or would like to think. And this has real, substantial implications in terms of thinking about how to combat these types of groups.
Has there been a difference that you see across extremists based on either geography or age or ideology? I know you've interviewed more than white supremacists as well. You've interviewed other types of extremists. So are there common threads, common trends with regard to these extremists? Or are there some things that are distinct to different ideologies like white supremacy?
Well, in terms of commonalities, I think there are some important social psychological factors that cut across most types of extremists in terms of tendencies of seeing the world in kind of cut and dry, black and white, kind of a difficulty dealing with ambiguity, wanting to put things in neat categories. I think that does tend to be pretty typical across most extremists. One of the things in terms of white supremacists that we find is that for individuals who tend to get involved in either late adolescence, early adulthood, we're finding some interesting commonalities in their backgrounds in terms of them facing certain kinds of environmental adversities, whether that be physical abuse in the home, sexual abuse in the home, substance abuse in their family, parental incarceration, parental abandonment, parental neglect. A lot of common risk factors that are very typical in terms of research that's been found with delinquency and criminality or conventional street gangs. We're finding some of those same types of risk factors with white supremacists among those that are getting involved in more neo-Nazi skinhead type groups, at least.
Is there a different demographic for different types of hate within a single ideology? In other words, racist skinheads versus more mundane older folks who are more literary or something?
Yeah, you do. I think there are some important differences there with skinhead groups obviously attracting more, younger folks that based on the kind of subcultural appeal with the music and so forth, it is a real big draw with skinheads. Most folks who get involved in skinhead groups come through the music, so that's kind of the common denominator there. in terms of attraction. Whereas with other segments, whether it be Klan or more older neo-Nazi type groups like the National Alliance, which at one time was one of the major neo-Nazi organizations, that would really try and attract a little bit older generations, more professional, more educated backgrounds. So you do see some interesting differences across different segments of the larger white supremacist movement. You were not all, as what someone once told me, not all swastikas are alike.
We've seen a younger demographic in the alt-right, and an attempt to sanitize some of the more overt Nazi symbolism, as well as a shift from biological determinism, in other words, that whites are genetically superior, to some kind of cultural and civilization dimension. Could you go into, how the alt-right has mainstreamed, or in some places supplanted some of the older neo-Nazi groups and Nazi groups that used to appeal to the younger demographic?
Absolutely. I think you put the your finger right on the pulse there, in terms of this move towards a cultural explanation, a cultural emphasis, which is really nothing new in a way, but certainly it's a way to try. If I tell you that one race is biologically superior, that has a sound to it that will put some people, certainly take them aback. And if I tell you the white race is on the verge of extinction biologically, there won't be whites that will exist in a few years, that's gonna maybe put you a little bit, make you uneasy. Whereas if I tell you that we are, Western civilization is under attack, and in particular we're at war with Islam, for some people who might be put off by the biological argument, they will feel a little more comfortable with this kind of cultural argument, this kind of clash of civilizations argument, which has played a role in various scholars' assessment of international affairs. So it is a fairly widespread way of thinking. And so folks on the alt-right understand that, and understand that if they use that framework and put things in that kind of terminology, they have much greater likelihood that they can appeal to a wider cross-section of white America, and other countries as well.
What are some changes you found to extreme far-right racist extremists over the last 20 years that you've been involved in this kind of analysis?
What could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. What are some changes you've seen to the racist extremist world,
Sure,
over the last 20 years since you've been doing direct observational research?
The big one is clearly cyberspace, right? The role of the internet in the last 20 years. The internet, the white supremacist movement was early in terms of utilizing the internet. It goes way back, even before the internet existed. White supremacists were using electronic bulletin boards and so forth to communicate. So early on, white supremacists recognized that this would be a powerful way in which they could essentially in a more anonymous fashion, with much easier access, they could distribute propaganda, they could try and recruit folks, they could use it for logistical planning of events, music shows, they could use it to organize really the entire music scene internationally is organized through cyberspace. So that was something early on that was recognized, and it's certainly continued. And now we find individuals like a Dylan Roof, who nothing really clearly documented in terms of him having a connection to any groups offline or relationships, but he did certainly have an online presence where he was communicating with white supremacists through different web forums like Stormfront, the Council of Conservative Citizens, and it was his initial foray into the propaganda was through basically a Google search. Initially, he was interested in learning more about the Trayvon Martin case, and from there he came in contact with a variety of different white supremacist propaganda that led him down a rabbit hole that eventually led him to walk into an African American church in South Carolina and murder 9 individuals. and now obviously facing potential death penalty.
So, how important? I get. Let me make these distinct questions. You can answer like A and B. How important is the internet as somehow almost supplanting organized hate groups because you don't have to join them anymore?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question is, what role does the music play with regard to these young racists?
Yeah. So as far as the first part of the question about the kind of supplanting of organizations, yeah, that's definitely happening. On the other hand, it's easy to confuse the internet with a lack of organization. There is organization in cyberspace, and that's important not to miss that. So there are communities that exist in cyberspace.
So more informal.
Informal, but in a way, not any. I mean, there were certainly there were formal organizations that had hierarchies and specific positions and so forth. But a lot of the organizations that existed outside of cyberspace were also largely organized in informal ways as well. So in that respect, I don't know how much different cyberspace is, but what it does is it allows people to connect with a click of a button. So at any time of the day, any day of the week, from the basement, from your work, from school, on your phone, on your laptop, on your desktop, I mean, it's just that access is so much greater with cyberspace than it was, obviously prior. In terms of the second part of the question, in terms of music, this is a very critical aspect, especially for younger folks, but even more broadly. Music is a form of communication that's universal across cultures. All cultures utilize music in some respect or another. It is a powerful tool to express oneself, to identify oneself, to come to a sense of where you exist within the larger world. And white supremacists recognize that and they utilize it to recruit new folks, to bring them into the fold, to introduce them to a larger social collective, but also to craft messages within these lyrics, sometimes in a very graphic, violent way, other times in much more subtle, innocuous ways. The music, which is most popular, tends to be a kind of a punk rock, but you also have more black, what's called National Socialist black metal, which is a very hard to understand kind of heavy drum sounds. But then there's also folk music, there's more pop style music, there's techno music. So you have country and western style white supremacist music, so multiple genres to appeal to as wide a cross section as possible. And it's powerful in that sometimes music is kind of a gateway of sorts, in that we see individuals who really kind of become heavily involved in white supremacist groups largely through the music, and then ultimately come to commit violent action. One of the individuals I spent a lot of time with early on in his career, really, of getting involved in white supremacist groups was an individual by the name of Wade Page. I met Page around 2000 and spent time with him off and on for the next about 2.5 years. And during that 2.5 years, he was really kind of starting to get involved in the white supremacist music scene. He was in multiple bands and playing shows all over the United States as well as in Europe.
But he wasn't violent at that time.
No, not at all. In fact, I directly observed him, stay out of fights. Whereas some of his the folks that he was friends with were getting into fights.
How old was he when you spent those couple of years in contact with him?
He would have been, he would have been around early 30s.
Was he into weaponry or drinking?
Well, he had by the time I met him, he'd been out of the he was served time in the army. He enlisted in the army in 1992, shortly after he graduated from high school. Was in the army for from 92 to 98, and it was actually during that time that he initially kind of started getting indoctrinated in white supremacist ideology, and had met someone who was already involved. When I met him, he still had his, Army issued rifle that he had in his bedroom, but it wasn't anything that he ever brandished about. He seemed to like weapons, but he wasn't, constantly talking about them or anything like that. He wasn't a very he was aggressive in the way he talked about, race war and things of that nature, but not any more than most of the other people that I was spending time with. He didn't stand out in the crowd. He actually, to be honest with you, I felt more comfortable around him than I did a lot of the other folks that I was spending time with who had been in and out of prison and had pretty extensive violent histories. Whereas, Page, to my knowledge, didn't have that, kind of background. So.
Before we continue a little bit more about Mr. Page, tell us about some of the icons, symbols, and items that these kinds of extremists like to collect. Books, symbols, things like that. Music.
In terms of
some
books,
of the bands that they like.
They are books are very important in that culture. Books reflect the ideology. It reflects a sense of literacy that surprisingly is very important in that world, because that's a kind of indicator of this racial superiority that they hold very close and dear to their way of thinking. The probably most prominent book is I guess it would be a toss-up between the Turner Diaries and Mein Kampf.
What about Clockwork Orange?
Yeah, and people talk about the movie more than the book there. But the Turner Diaries is I think probably in reality the most read. More than people talk a lot about Mein Kampf, but fewer actually take the time to read it. It's a little harder to get through. Turner Diaries is an easy read, and so people certainly do take advantage of reading that, which is a white supremacist fantasy novel that has had a great influence. It was authored by the founder of the National Alliance, William Pierce, and it influenced Tim McVeigh in terms of the Oklahoma City bombing. It influenced Robert Matthews in the formation of the Silent Brotherhood, which was a terrorist underground cell active in the 1980s. So over the years, the Turner Diaries has certainly been a very influential one.
What are some of the hate rock bands that are among the most prominent or historic that you've seen?
Sure. What's called the godfather of white power music is Screwdriver. Screwdriver was founded by Ian Stewart, who became a kind of a living legend of sorts, especially for skinheads. He was a British musician who started off playing covers of Rolling Stones songs, ironically enough, but then moved into more of a kind of a neo-fascist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi kind of punk music, oi they call it, and founded Blood and Honor, which became this global neo-Nazi skinhead organization that still exists today. Stewart died in a car accident in the early 90s, and really became kind of a martyr for the movement. Some people thought that the British government actually set up the car accident, so there's been a lot of conspiracy theories over the years about that.
What are some of the symbols that folks should look for?
Sure.
The crucified skinhead.
Yeah, crucified, of course, the most obvious one being the swastika. But then there's a lot of numerical codes that a lot of people might not be familiar with. So for instance, 88, which stands for Heil Hitler, 8th letter of the alphabet being H. 14 is huge, which stands for the 14 words: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Lots of organizations will develop their own kind of idiosyncratic numerical codes that basically stand for the name of their organization. So some of those are really hard to kind of determine if you're not in the know, so to speak. The hammers, the crossed hammers, which is the Hammerskin Nation's organizational symbol. A lot of times you'll see folks with tattoos of crossed hammers.
But the cross hammers and the Celtic cross, for instance, and some of these other symbols have been downplayed by some of the folks in the alt-right, at least publicly, so not to scare away.
Sure. Beginning in the mid-90s especially, you had prominent white supremacists like Tom Metzger really saying, look, it's time for people to cover up the tattoos, or just don't even get tattoos in the first place. Grow your hair out. Put on a shirt and tie, get yourself educated, get a job in a police department, go to the military and get the best training in the world, go to law school, become a teacher, infiltrate the system. This is our real hope for survival. If we're going to be successful in the future, we need to get people inside the system. So that's been percolating for quite a while now. And the alt-right really, in my estimation, is kind of bringing this to fruition.
Let's close with what happened with Wade Page. So you had done observational research on him. He was playing hate rock music. And then what happened later after you ceased communicating with him?
Last time I saw him would have been summer of 2002, 2003 at a music show in Colorado. And then almost 10 years later, in August of 2012, August 5th of 2012, Page, by this time, had become an actual formal member of the Hammerskin Nation. He walked into a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. He was carrying a loaded 9mm handgun with extra ammunition, earbuds in, and he began to methodically basically walk around the temple and started shooting people. He killed 6 individuals, left the temple, got into a gunfight with law enforcement who had arrived on the scene. By that time, he shot and injured one of the first officer on the scene, I believe 11 times. Officer managed to survive miraculously. Eventually, Page was wounded in the stomach and then took his own life, shot himself in the head.
Do we know what he was listening to when he was doing this attack?
Believe the earbuds were to block noise. Actually, he wasn't listening to anything. Was what one of the witnesses described to me.
Did you have any thought that his ideology would translate into that kind of violence directly from him?
Directly from him, no. I've been longly aware, for a long time, been aware of that potential for the kind of messages that are built into the ideology and how closely tied it is to violence, but certainly did not expect to see that coming from him directly or have any indication that he would end up doing something like that.
Is there anything you'd like to close with that we didn't address?
No, I think we covered it.
Well, Pete Simi, Professor, Chapman University, author of the excellent book American Swastika. Thank you so much for talking to us tonight, and we look forward to talking to you more, and thanks for being on our advisory board.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.